What would you do if you had only $50 left to your name, a freezing child in your arms, and no roof over your head? Imagine yourself on a gray morning in the autumn of 1891, standing on the front step of a cabin that the whole town has warned you against, with the last gold piece your late husband ever earned pressed into the palm of your hand. We watch her push open the warped oak door. The hinges groan, and a breath of cold, mineral air rolls out of the dark. Her 5-year-old boy stands close behind her, holding a wooden horse his father whittled, and he does not know that beneath the boards his mother is about to lay her hand upon lies the kind of discovery that rearranges a life, not coins heaped in a chest, not the tidy treasure of a children's story, but something deeper, something patient, something a quiet man hid here decades ago and trusted the next honest hand to find. We see her, in this moment, as she will be decades from now, a woman whose name the county will write into the deeds, whose widowhood will become a kind of inheritance, whose boy will grow into a man worthy of the father he barely remembers. But that is later. That is the long, slow arc of a life that has not yet begun to bloom. Right now, on this gray morning, she is simply Eliza Warren, and she has $50, and the door is open, and she is about to walk inside. That we must rewind now, back across the months that brought her to this doorstep, because no journey of courage ever begins at the door it finally opens. The autumn that took Eliza Warren's home was the cruelest season of her life, and it was not cruel because of the cold. Blackwood Grove had known colder autumns. The cruelness lay in the slowness of it. For 3 years, since the consumptive fever had carried her husband Thomas out through the kitchen door on a stretcher made of split cedar, Eliza had been holding their small house up with both hands. It had been a lean frame place on the eastern edge of town, built by Thomas with help from the church volunteers during the first summer of their marriage, and it had stood firm through 8 winters before the bank in Red Bluff decided that a widow's signature on a small note was no longer enough collateral to carry it through another. The note had been paid faithfully every quarter, in silver and in small bills counted out of an old cigar box beneath her bed. But when the bank changed clerks in the fall of '90, the new clerk looked at the file and decided that the arithmetic of Eliza's widowhood no longer penciled out, and he sold the note for $38 to a man named Harlan Briggs, who had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity and who wore a black wool coat even in summer and who spoke softly in church and loudly in his office and who believed, with the quiet conviction of a man who had never missed a meal in his life, that the poor ought to stay poor so that the rest of us would know what hard work meant. Briggs came to her door on a Tuesday in October, with 2 witnesses and a writ of foreclosure folded into his coat pocket, and he stood in the entryway of her home and watched her read the paper in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. She did not weep. She folded the paper along the same creases the marshal had folded it along, and she handed it back, and she told him, in a voice so steady it surprised even her, that she would be gone by week's end. Liam was 3 years old when his father died. He was 5 years old now, and he had the same sharp jaw and quiet gray eyes, and he watched the world the way his father had watched it, as if he were waiting to be told what came next. He sat beneath the kitchen table that night and held his wooden horse and asked his mother where they would go, and the question, more than the cold and more than the rain, was the thing that nearly broke Eliza Warren that night after Liam had fallen asleep against her side. She unfolded the red flannel square she kept beneath the buckram lid of her husband's Bible, and she held the Liberty head between her fingers. It was a $20 gold piece Thomas had carried home from a railroad job in Sacramento in the summer before his sickness began, and it was the last warm thing in the house that still held his scent. She had, in the tin behind the stove, an additional $29.41 in silver and small notes, the sum of 2 years of blackberry picking, mending, and laundry carried up the hill to the ranchers' wives. Together, they made $49.41. Together, they were everything she had. She counted it twice. She did not weep. She wrapped the Liberty head back in its flannel and tucked it beneath her pillow, and the next morning, with Liam's hand in hers and a single carpetbag hanging from her shoulder, she walked into town and asked at the post office whether anyone in Blackwood Grove had anything left to sell that could shelter a mother and her child before the first hard frost of November. The thing that was left to sell was the Whitaker place, and the town had been preparing to be rid of it for nearly a month. Old Dr. Whitaker had been dead for 11 years, and the cabin he had built with his own hands in the early 50s stood on a low rise about 1.25 miles from the schoolhouse, down a road the county had not properly graded since the war. The roof had caved in over the back bedroom. The chimney had come loose from its shoulders and tilted conspicuously toward the south, as if it had grown tired of standing up and meant to lie down soon. The yard had grown up in wild rose and scrub pine until the cabin looked less like a house and more like a small dark animal crouched in the underbrush, watching the road. The people of Blackwood Grove whispered about the place with the gentle, tired superstition of a frontier town that had lost too many of its sons to fevers and accidents to look at any patch of empty ground without wondering what had gone wrong there. A peddler who had tried to sleep overnight in the front room in '87 had come down with the swamp fever within a fortnight. A cattle buyer had tried to winter a single steer in the front paddock and lost the animal to blackleg before the new year. Andrew Calloway, the town auctioneer, climbed onto a stump outside the feed store on Friday and announced that the Whitaker place would sell to the highest bidder on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, that the minimum bid would be set at $40, and that no one in his right mind would pay a cent more for a cabin that was rumored to be lonely, broken, and possibly possessed. That we were there the next morning. We stood in a loose half-circle on the muddy lane outside the cabin, our breath rising in pale clouds, our hands buried deep in our pockets. Eliza came down the slope from the north, with Liam walking beside her in his too large coat, and we saw the men at the half-circle turn to look at her, not unkindly, but with that gentle, tired pity that frontier towns reserve for those who are about to do something the rest of us consider foolish. Calloway climbed back onto his stump and cleared his throat and called the opening bid of $40. Nobody spoke. He called it again. A rancher at the back of the crowd spat tobacco juice into the mud and looked away at the low ridge of the eastern hills. 40, Calloway repeated for the third time, and as the syllable was leaving his mouth Eliza stepped forward and said, in a voice that was thin but entirely steady, $50. The crowd went silent the way a forest goes silent when a hawk crosses overhead. Calloway blinked that he asked her once whether she meant it, and she answered him not in words but by stepping up to the stump and laying the folded muslin square into his palm, and when he peeled back the flannel and saw the Liberty head lying there in the gray morning light, the whole of Blackwood Grove understood that the woman standing in front of them had just spent, on a roof that did not stand up straight and a chimney that did not stand up at all, every dollar she had left upon the earth. The walk to the cabin that afternoon was a long one for a boy in a too large coat. Eliza carried most of their belongings in the carpet bag, a change of clothes for each of them, a tin of coffee, a small bag of flour, a skillet, the worn Bible, and a folded sack of cornmeal that Mrs. Halloran from the church had pressed into her hands at the bottom of the lane without saying a word. Liam did not complain. He held his mother's skirt with one hand and his wooden horse in the other, and he asked her only once, near the top of the rise, whether bears lived in the wild roses. She told him they did, and that he should walk softly, and he walked softly, and we walked with him. When the cabin came into view at last, we could see the truth of what the town had been saying and the lie of what the town had been saying. The roof sagged. The chimney leaned. The windows were patched with flour sacks and a piece of an old prairie skirt. The porch had half collapsed into a thicket of blackberry bramble, and the floor of the back bedroom opened directly onto a square of gray sky. But the logs of the walls were sound, and seasoned to their cores. The floor in the front room, where Eliza could see it through the gaps in the door, was 2-inch oak planks that had been laid true by a careful hand. The little stovepipe chimney, even at its tilt, still climbed above the ridge. The cabin, Eliza said softly to herself, was still a house, and a house, even a broken one, was something she and Liam could mend. She set Liam on the porch stump with a heel of bread and a small tin cup of water, and she went inside alone. The smell was the first thing to meet her, old wood, mouse nest, damp wool, and the faint mineral tang of cold stone drawn up through the floor. The single front room held a wood-burning stove with a riveted belly, a chair whose back had broken in two, a low table with a cracked knot at its center, and not a single curtain in either window. Behind it, through a low rough door, was the bedroom where the roof had given way, a square of open sky let down through the rotted boards where the rain, on certain nights, came straight in. Eliza did not weep at the sight. She set down her bag, lifted her sleeves, and began to work. We watched her as she pulled the bramble back from the porch step by step, bracing each board with a stone from the yard until the front walk stood level. We watched her sweep the joists with a broom made of peeled willow switches, and the dust that came up from between the planks smelled of earth and old pine resin, the same scent we had smelled as children in cabins of our own. She found dry wood stacked in a shed built against the back wall, wood the Whitaker had cut and split before his last winter, kept dry beneath a roof of cedar shakes just tight enough to take a flame. She carried an armload inside and laid the fire with the patience of a woman who had learned, somewhere in the long years since Thomas had gone, that a small flame well tended will outlast any blaze that is lit in anger. When the fire caught, the cabin warmed in a slow, even bloom, and the shadows on the walls softened, and Liam came in and sat down on the folded burlap that was to be their bed and pulled his knees up to his chest and watched the light move across his mother's face, and called her brave, which was a word he had heard an old blacksmith say the previous summer and which he now offered her as if it were a coin. For the first 3 nights, they lived in the front room only, and they lived like people who had been granted a small reprieve and meant to use it carefully. Eliza mended the broken chair with a strip of rawhide she cut from an old bridle hanging in the shed. Eliza mended the broken chair with a strip of rawhide she cut from an old bridle hanging in the shed. She built a small curtain for the bedroom window from a flour sack and a length of thread she unraveled from a torn petticoat. She found, in a rusted tin beneath the porch, a stub of candle and a single wooden match, and she placed them on the table beside the stove as if they were the silver candlesticks of a finer house. Liam began to gather kindling in the mornings, and learned to tell good pine from bad by the smell of it, and spoke to the chickadees at the edge of the wood the way his father had spoken to the cattle. On the 4th afternoon, with the rain holding off and the sun briefly warm across the yard, Eliza looked up at the bedroom ceiling and thought, aloud, that perhaps they ought to begin pulling the rotten boards down. And that is when the story of the Whitaker place began, beneath the surface, to show itself to her. She had been on the bedroom floor for the better part of an hour, prying up the broken planks near the hearthstone, when the point of her pry bar turned up not wood but a small iron ring set flush into a flat cross plank that did not belong with the rest of the floor at all. She knelt and brushed the dust from it with the flat of her hand, and the iron was cool to the touch and was mortared into a board that, when she levered it up, revealed a narrow oak door set into the floor and hung on old brass hinges that were still, somehow, free of rust. Beneath it, a ladder of blackened wooden rungs descended into the dark. Eliza did not climb down that first night. She closed the hatch, replaced the cross plank, and sat for a long time on the edge of the bed with her hand over her mouth, listening to Liam's breath in the other room and the soft ticking of the stove as it cooled. That it was 3 days more before she went down with the candle, and what she found there was not a chest of coins, but a small dry room cut from the living stone of the hill, holding 3 things that rearranged her understanding of every quiet footstep the Whitaker place had ever taken. The first was a tin strongbox, hinged and rusted shut, which held within it a stack of journals bound in oilcloth and filled, in a doctor's tight and careful hand, with the case notes of a man who had tended every settler for 20 miles around for nearly 30 years. The second was a leather folder with a brass clasp, holding a set of land deeds and surveyor's notes dating back to the founding grant of the township, and a folded map marked with a red wax seal that traced, in the doctor's own hand, a long, slow seam of silver-bearing galena running in an arc beneath the rise on which the cabin sat. The third was a single rolled letter, addressed to no one, dated April of 1869, in which the doctor had written, in lines that were no longer entirely steady, that he had been unable to bring the vein to mill in his own lifetime and that he prayed whoever found these pages would understand what he had understood, that the seam under his house was not lead and was not coal, and was worth, if worked patiently, more than the land itself. Eliza stood in the candlelight for a long time after that. She did not shout. She did not weep. She stood still and listened to her own breathing, and thought of Thomas, and thought of the liberty head she had laid into Calloway's palm at the stump, and thought of every winter that had tried, in turn, to take what little she had been able to keep. And then she folded the letter, slipped the deeds back into the leather folder, returned the journals to the strongbox, and climbed the ladder with the care of a woman who understood that what she held was not merely silver, but a kind of trust she had not earned until this very moment and could not afford to squander if she meant to keep it. She closed the hatch. She set the crossplank back into place. She brushed the dust from her skirt, hung the pry bar back on its hook, and went into the front room where Liam was teaching himself to whistle, and did not, in any way that mattered, know that his mother had just come back from the bottom of the world. Over the next several weeks, she read the journals by candlelight after Liam had gone to sleep. She learned that Dr. Whitaker had been a quiet, methodical man who had treated the typhoid of '63, the cholera of '66, and the long consumptive fevers of the years that followed, and who had done it all without ever advertising what he had found beneath his own hearthstone. The scene he had traced ran in a slow arc beneath the rise, and the surveyor's notes confirmed that the original grant of the property extended 300 feet down through the bedrock. She learned, too, that the doctor had written to a young cousin in Boston about working the vein together, and that the cousin had died of the very fever the doctor had gone out to tend before any answer could be returned. The vein, the doctor had written in the margin of his final entry, had not been abandoned because it had played out. It had been abandoned because the man who had known it best had run out of years. Eliza sat at the kitchen table one night and closed the journal and thought, with the same steadiness she had brought to the auction stump, that what she was holding now was not gold to be spent recklessly, but a key that opened, very slowly, the same life that had been closed to her for every winter since Thomas had gone. That it could not, of course, remain quiet for long. A woman living alone with a child in the Whitaker place, working odd jobs in town and somehow paying off old debts and lighting new lamps and putting fresh shingles on her porch, was precisely the kind of woman that Blackwood Grove noticed. That it was in December of '91, with the first snow gathering on the dark pines to the north, that Harlan Briggs appeared at the cabin door in the late afternoon. His black wool coat dusted white at the shoulders, his mouth set in the same grim line we had seen at the Warren eviction. He had come, he said, with a piece of news he thought she ought to hear. A company of Eastern financiers, Briggs told her, had been nosing through the county's old mineral surveys, and they were prepared to offer a substantial sum for any property that carried an attested seam of silver-bearing rock beneath it. The Whitaker place, he said, was one of 3 parcels in the running. He had acquired the adjacent tract the previous autumn through a quiet transaction with a timber company that did not know what it had been selling. If Eliza were to sign a quitclaim deed and vacate the property by the 1st of January, the Eastern Company would compensate her generously, $500, and a one-way ticket on the railroad to anywhere she chose to go. If she refused, Briggs said, his quiet partners in the East would simply file for mineral rights through the county court and take the seam from beneath her feet whether she stood on the ground above it or not. We were standing in the doorway of the shed when he said it, and we watched Eliza's hands go still against the broom she was holding. Liam was in the yard, packing a small snowball with exaggerated care, the way only a child can take a small soft thing and pretend it is a stone he means to throw. Eliza did not speak for a long moment. She set the broom against the wall, invited Briggs inside out of the cold, and asked him whether he would care to see the original land grant of the Whitaker place, including the surveyed depth of the bedrock and the recorded mineral rights of the original claimant. She reached into the cupboard beside the stove, drew out the leather folder, and laid it open on the table between them. She turned, one by one, to the page on which Dr. Whitaker had recorded his find, and to the page on which the county clerk had, in 1849, attested the mineral rights of every original claimant who had filed a claim before the second Tuesday of June. The Whitaker grant, Eliza showed Briggs calmly, was the 3rd such claim to be recorded in the township. The Eastern Company's filing, dated the previous week, was the 17th. And in 19 pages of carefully preserved surveyor's notes, the seam beneath the Whitaker place was named, in the doctor's own hand, as belonging to the original claimant and to no one else until and unless that claimant chose, of his own free will and without coercion, to part with it. Eliza did not threaten Briggs. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked him, with a politeness that was colder than the snow on his shoulders, to please inform his Eastern partners that the claimant in question had chosen, of her own free will and without coercion, not to part with it. Briggs sat with the folder open in his lap for nearly 5 minutes. Then he closed it, set it back on the table, and stood. He told her, in a voice that was no longer quite steady, that the Eastern partners would take the matter to the county court in the spring. Eliza told him, with the same warm politeness, that the county court would find at the head of its docket in the spring the original claimant's petition to reaffirm the Whitaker grant, and that the petition had already been accepted for filing by the clerk the previous Friday. She walked him to the door. She watched him go down the lane. She watched him until he had turned the bend at the wild rose thicket, and then she sat down on the porch step and put her face in her hands for the first and only time in that long winter. We sat down beside her and let her weep, because some winters do not end until a woman has been allowed to weep in them. The county court ruled in her favor in March of '92, and the Eastern Company withdrew its filing in April. By the summer of '92, Eliza had quietly entered into a working agreement with a small smelting outfit in Red Bluff that had, in its time, handled ore from a half-dozen abandoned claims in the foothills. She did not sell the seam. She did not gamble it. She worked it the way she had worked every blessed thing in her life, patiently, methodically, and with great care for the hands that did the actual labor. She hired 2 of the men who had laughed at her at the auction, in the first instance, and she paid them a fair wage in silver coin and let them see the ledger herself each Saturday evening, because she had learned from a dry goods store on Main Street that no man who can read his own wages will ever believe he has been cheated. By the autumn of '93, the road to the Whitaker place had been graded for the first time in 15 years, and the cabin had a proper shingle roof, and the chimney stood up straight, and there was a small bell hung by a wire at the front gate so that any traveler in the dark could find his way to her door. In the spring of '94, she made a journey to the county seat and signed a deed of trust for a small stone building on the eastern edge of Blackwood Grove that had stood empty since the war. She furnished it with cots and linen and a small kitchen in the back, and opened its doors to any child in the county whose family could not, in that particular winter, give them a warm place to sleep. She called it the Whitaker House, in honor of the doctor whose journals had given her the key she had never asked to be given and whose quiet, methodical example she had tried, in her own small way, to follow. Liam grew into a quiet, fair young man who inherited his father's interest in the land and his mother's instinct for keeping books, and who took over the running of the smelting agreement in the year he turned 17. The Whitaker House stood for 43 years before the next generation tore it down, and in those 43 years it held, at one time or another, more than 260 children of Blackwood Grove. And so we come back to where we began, on a winter afternoon not so different from the one in which Eliza first laid her hand upon the iron ring. The seam still runs in its long, slow arc beneath the rise. The hatch is still there, though it is closed now, and the rungs are worn smooth from 100 quiet descents. The chimney stands up straight, and the roof has new shingles, and the bell on the front gate speaks softly into the wind when a traveler in the dark draws near. On the corner of the kitchen table, a small square of folded red flannel rests beside a stub of candle, though the Liberty head is no longer inside it. It is, instead, in the vest pocket of her son, who keeps it there beside his heart, because he knows, in the way his father knew and his mother knew and the doctor knew before any of them, that the quiet worth of a life is not measured at all in what a person manages to keep, but in what a person decides, at the last, to give away. That if you were in Eliza's position, would you have taken that $50 gamble on an abandoned cabin? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if Eliza's story inspired you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay tuned for more forgotten tales of the frontier.